European migration, indecisive druids, and the beginning of a new religion. I'm Matt, and this is the Spectred Isle. Welcome to the Spectred Isle, a channel dedicated to the myths, mysteries and malcontents that inhabit these great isles of Britain. Today marks the first of many delves into the old religions of the Isles, the pre-Christian deities worshipped by our ancestors, who they were, what they represented and where they came from. The first god I'll be discussing is Cernunnos, but bear with me because before that I have to do a lot of rambling about the Celtic gods in general so you can get some context as to what we know about them. First, I want to touch on the origins of a lot of these gods. For the sake of this, we'll put Ireland to one side. Don't get me wrong, their mythology is incredible and their pantheon of gods is massive, but it also seems, from my current level of research, completely their own. For Great Britain, however, the old gods worshipped here can also be seen across Northern Europe, and a lot of them were brought to Britain by migration and invasion from the European mainland. Not all of them, but most. You might be thinking, but Matt, the Spectred Isle is wholly dedicated to the British Isles. Why are we looking at European gods? Well, for one, it's difficult to define who exactly the native people of the British Isles are. There's evidence of human activity as far back as 900,000 years before the Ice Age. Fast forward a long time and you get the Beaker people. They were invaded and seemingly replaced by the Celts. They were invaded and half replaced, half integrated by the Romans. They left and were replaced by the Jutes, Angles and Saxons. They were invaded by the Norse and Danes, otherwise known as the Vikings, who settled and stayed in many parts of the island. Then were invaded by the French, and they stuck around and integrated themselves into the bloodlines. Britain, just like everywhere else really, is massively shaped by outside forces that came in and rocked our culture. But these old gods that I'm focusing on are generally speaking the ones belonging to the Celts, so let's go into that. They will likely be getting their own video or series potentially at some stage to really get into the mythology and romance surrounding these ancient people, especially the Druids. But in the quickest terms possible, nobody really knows where the Celts came from. For a long time, a popular theory was they originated from the Hallstatt culture in Central Europe and just expanded out to cover most of Western Europe. In modern times, that theory has slowly been rejected in favour of some suggesting they came from the western Atlantic coast of Europe, and another that actually it was sort of in between those areas. Another point of contention is that the name Celts for a certain group of people was actually what a tribe of Gauls living around modern Marseille called themselves, and it was just because Roman and Greek scholars who explored the rest of Europe found them first, noticed the cultural and linguistic similarities between them and the other tribes in the region, and just assumed they were all called Celts. We'll never really know the exact origins, but what we do clearly know is that there are so many similarities in tribal cultures and the languages spoken across much of Europe during that time that there must have been some origin point. So thanks to all of these competing theories, we've narrowed that origin point down to here. History! Of these notable similarities in culture, one of the key ones is the gods that were worshipped by the various Celtic populations. You see how I brought that back to topic? That was good, right? Anyway, let's discuss the old gods. I will give fair warning that once I've covered this bit about the gods in general, the rest of this video is probably going to cover a small amount of historical fact, or at best theories, and instead lean much more into fantasy, hyperbole and modern romanticism of the gods, mainly because it is much more fun and entertaining that way. It's also useful that we're not relying on historical fact because the waters are that muddied that it's been difficult to actually figure out who all the Celtic deities were. when they entered the culture as a worshipped god, and who even came up with them. Celtic artwork from before the Roman conquest of the various Celtic territories doesn't seem to feature much of any images of gods, at least as far as we know, and written language was so uncommon before the Romans came along that the images we do have don't have any inscriptions to tell us who they were. This has led to some theories that either pre-Roman Celtic deities just weren't a thing, or they were more abstract than the idea of a humanoid figure with powers, in the same way that modern spiritualists view fate and karma as ethereal course correctors or a process-like force along the lines of gravity. The idea is that the Roman influence on the Celtic people gave them the idea of physical manifestations of gods, and even assigned their abstract godly forces to the equivalent Roman deity, which is why when gods are referred to on Celtic inscriptions, they usually use both the Roman and Celtic names, like Lenus Mars or Sulis Minerva. Personally, I think there probably were physical, human-like gods worshipped by the Celts. Human history is a tapestry of assigning order to chaos so we can understand our place in the world, and the imagery of a human is comfortingly familiar. So why wouldn't a Bronze Age Celtic peasant try to justify their fear of something as inexplicably terrifying as a lightning storm by making it the angry outburst of a guy that looks just like him? I also like to look to Julius Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico, his account of the Gallic War, in which he describes 6 different gods the Celts worshipped, but used the Roman names for them, such as saying the Celts honoured Mercury above all deities. I think that typical display of Roman arrogance uncovers the likely truth that Celts did worship their own gods, but when the Romans came along and saw the carvings and the effigies and so on, they decided, actually, these are just our gods, you just got the wrong name. Look at this, the Celts honour Mercury. Actually mate, we worship, I said you honour Mercury. The unfortunate truth is that, much like the rest of ancient pre-Roman British history, the culture of the Celtic religion is largely undocumented and only really told through the eyes of the Romans, whose basic approach was, they do things differently to us, so we must change their minds by force. In fact, there is only one existing image that is most definitely Cernunnos, because it's the only depiction of the horned god that actually has his name next to it, and that's on the Pillar of the Boatman, a ceremonial pillar carved by the sailors of the Parisii, a Gallic tribe in the old city of Lutetia, which is where Paris is found now. In fact, the pillar was discovered in the foundations of Notre Dame, having been used in the 4th century to build the wall for the island of the city, because apparently Neolithic priests were happy to drag giant stones from Wales to Wiltshire to build Stonehenge, but 4th century Frenchmen couldn't be asked quarrying more stone when there were historical artifacts that could be used instead. So even though we have depictions of what we believe to be Cernunnos, a horned, sometimes half-man, half-deer fellow sitting cross-legged, surrounded by deer and boar and dogs, and holding something like a talk bag or cornucopia, we can't say for certain that it's absolutely him. We also aren't sure what exactly he was the god of. There are various interpretations out there and they all put him down as different things, including animals, nature, fertility, prosperity, authority, strength, endurance, virility, travel, commerce, crossroads, the underworld, reincarnation, and the cycle of life and death. That's 14 different things by my count. There's no wonder he's always depicted sitting down, because the guy must be knackered. The funny thing is, even in modern interpretations, nobody can decide what Cernunnos is the god of. We have so little historical information to go on that modern druids could basically have sat down and said, okay, this is the pantheon, laid out, decisive, definitive, that's it. But they didn't. For instance, Cernunnos appears in the Druidcraft Tarot deck in place of the traditional Devil card. Now this isn't meant to imply that he is a devil or a demon or whatever. The card tends to represent excess, overindulgence, vice, that sort of thing. It's not necessarily evil behaviour, it's more about gluttony, too much of a good thing and so on. Not a demon, but your demon. Which is why whenever I choose to lie on the couch and game instead of working on my next video, I call it my Cernunnos time. That's cringe as hell. But head over to the Druidry website and you'll be told that Cernunnos is the god of fertility in nature, but also somehow the lord of the underworld who hunts the souls of the evil. Oh, and also he's responsible for evolution, as well as harvests, animals and forests, and he's the embodiment of male sexual energy. It gets so complicated that they have to essentially say Cernunnos has multiple different aspects, and that he's the first and grandest of the ancient ones, presumably as a way of explaining how he's apparently the god of almost everything. There is also a lot of differing imagery associated with Cernunnos. The traditional look is the antlered man, or more extreme half man half deer look, derived as such because the name Cernunnos essentially means the horned one, but there are others as well. For one, the infamous green man figure, a foliage covered fellow that rose to prominence in 12th century Gothic architecture. Referenced as a pagan fertility god, he's often viewed as some form of tree spirit like a wood nymph, a spriggan or a leshy. He's also linked to characters such as Robin Hood and Peter Pan, and is often referred to as the Wild Man of the Wood. However, due to the similarities in realm and powers, there is also a druidic link to Cernunnos, to the point where often the Green Man is given horns that weren't present on the original motif. With his interpretations of being a hunter of evil souls and keeper of the underworld, he's also often associated with being the leader of the Wild Hunt, which we will be getting to in a video soon. And the more focused figure of Herne the Hunter, who Shakespeare referenced in The Merry Wives of Windsor as a ghost that stalks the Windsor forest and is also seen as the leader of the Wild Hunt. All of these are described as having antlers or horns, which creates the Cernunnos connection, as does Pan, the satyr from Greek mythology that shares the horned head as well as the link to male fertility. With Cernunnos being such an enduring figure of nature, life and death, and the bridge between the human world and the natural world, there are many other mythological figures that can be described as an aspect of this ancient, seemingly all-encompassing god. You know what? Given all that, let's just come up with our own interpretation. Maybe create ourselves a whole new mythology as we go along. So here we go. This is the true tale of Cernunnos, as made up by me, because why not? Everyone else makes it up as well. Of the entire Celtic pantheon of gods, Cernunnos was the most insular, the most reserved and introverted, and yet also the most revered. Have you ever walked through a forest and felt like 1,000 eyes were watching you from within thickets and behind trees? Have you ever looked out at a spectacular view and found your breath catch in your throat? Have you ever watched the clash of antlers as two deer vie for dominance, or seen two puppies having a playful tumble together, or marvelled at how migrating birds know where to fly and what formation to fly in? These are all the works of Cernunnos, and that persistent appreciation of the majesty of nature that humans have always been enthralled by, even to this day, truly shows his might and divine power. Couple this almost effortless adoration from the humans with his preferences to live deep in the forests and befriend the animals over his fellow gods, and you can see why the jealousy and dejection felt by the rest of the pantheon led to his downfall. Slowly but surely they convinced the people that Cernunnos was not the bountiful lord of the forest that they praised him as, but a sexual deviant, a champion of the underworld, a hunter of human souls. They poisoned the minds of the populace until Cernunnos was seen as no more than a devil. Eventually all the gods began to diminish when the humans chose to worship one of their own, a man named Jesus, in favour of the ancient spirits, but Cernunnos felt it worse than the others. Despite being less than an afterthought as time and humanity moved on, the scarlet words of the other gods persisted in the imagination of the people, and unconsciously they began not just to reject Cernunnos, but to befoul his creations. Some animals were domesticated, some kept captive, and others reduced to food sources. No longer could they run wild and free through the woods and valleys. Places of rugged terrain and overgrown natural beauty were torn up and flattened for space, the living wood and moss and grass replaced by cold, dead stone and brick. And eventually, The open and accessible playground that Cernunnos created for the people was ignored in favour of enclosed spaces and focused entertainment, staring into devices or at screens. By the way, like and subscribe and all that. But Cernunnos was not wholly defeated, because those who do venture into the wild and untamed parts of the world, who take a tour of his workshop of wonder, allow themselves to feel that primal, terrifying yet comfortable acceptance that they are but a small, finite piece of an eternal, enduring design. And just as he is the oldest of the Ancient Ones, the firstborn of the goddess, so too will he be the last, still here after we've all passed on and his abiding creations reclaim the land that we tried to take. So that's all I have for you on Cernunnos. Like I said before, the actual documented historical fact, or evidence at least, is very thin on the ground, so I hope you enjoyed the made up origin story or made up mythology or whatever you want to call it that I gave you instead. I may even turn that into a longer piece and come up with a whole new Bible for those of us that want to celebrate the ancient pagan ways the way our ancestors used to all those years ago. Naturally, it's up to you whether you choose to believe in Cernunnos and the rest of the old gods or not, but as I always say, a world bereft of magic and mystery is a boring world to live in. Stay safe, stay sane, and have a good one.